Exposing the boss's dirty secrets, how Camille turned the tables. Camille had always been the kind of employee managers dreamed of: efficient, reliable, and quietly brilliant. She never made waves, always met her deadlines, and took on extra work when the team needed her. It was why she had been promoted to a mid-level manager role 2 years ago, despite the notoriously high turnover in David's department. David Carter, the head of the department, had a reputation for running a tight ship. To outsiders, he was a charismatic leader with a sharp mind and an impressive track record. But within the team, whispers of favoritism and questionable ethics circulated, though no one dared to voice them aloud. Camille had learned early on to keep her head down and focus on her work. It wasn't her dream job, but she liked her coworkers and felt a sense of accomplishment in her projects. That is, until Elise joined the team. The arrival of Elise. Elise Harper breezed into the department one unremarkable Monday morning. Her entrance, anything but unremarkable. She was polished, confident, and immediately commanding attention with her easy charm. At 27, she was younger than most of the team, but carried herself with an air of self-assuredness that belied her lack of experience. Elise was friendly enough at first, peppering Camille with questions about processes and projects. But it didn't take long for her true colors to show. Within weeks, Elise had a knack for claiming credit for small successes while deflecting blame for mistakes. She often lingered at David's desk, laughing at his jokes and staying after hours to catch up on work. By the end of her first month, Elise's presence had already begun to shift the dynamics of the team. Camille first noticed the change during a department meeting. She had spent weeks preparing a detailed proposal for a new client pitch, working late nights and weekends to perfect it. As David reviewed the presentation, he nodded approvingly and said, "Great job on this, Elise." Camille's stomach sank. Elise, who had barely contributed to the project, smiled brightly. "Thank you, David. I'm glad you liked it." Over the next few weeks, Elise became a constant presence in David's office. Her workload began to dwindle, while Camille's seemed to double. Projects that Elise was assigned mysteriously found their way to Camille's inbox, often with vague instructions to take care of this. At first, Camille tried to keep up, but the sheer volume of work was overwhelming. When she approached David to discuss the imbalance, his response was curt. "Elise is working late every night," he said, his tone implying Camille wasn't doing enough. "Maybe you need to manage your time better." It was a slap in the face. Camille had been the one staying late, skipping lunch breaks and sacrificing weekends. But Elise's long hours were more about lingering at David's desk than completing actual work. The changes didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the team. Employees began whispering about Elise in David's late-night meetings and the way she seemed to glide through her assignments with minimal effort. The department's morale plummeted. Turnover, already an issue, spiked as employees left for better opportunities. Those who stayed grew resentful, their frustration simmering beneath a thin veneer of professionalism. By the time Camille received her first performance write-up, she was running on fumes. It was a Friday afternoon when the email from HR landed in her inbox. "Camille, please see me in my office at 3 p.m., the subject line read. "Camille, I've noticed a drop in your productivity over the past few months," Marie began, sliding a paper across the desk. It was a formal warning for missed deadlines. Camille's stomach churned. "Marie, I can explain," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I've been taking on extra work. Elise's projects keep getting reassigned to me, and it's been hard to keep up." Marie frowned. "Why are you handling Elise's work?" "That's a question for David," Camille replied, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. Marie studied her for a moment before leaning back in her chair. "Camille, I've been hearing rumblings about dissatisfaction in your department. You're not the first person to mention an issue with workload. I'm going to conduct a broader inquiry into what's going on." Camille nodded, a flicker of hope sparking inside her. The inquiry, however, seemed to trigger more backlash. David began scrutinizing Camille's work more closely, nitpicking minor details and calling her out in meetings. Elise, emboldened by David's favoritism, became bolder in her manipulation. During one meeting, David assigned Camille yet another one of Elise's projects. "Camille, I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I trust you can handle this," he said, his tone dripping with false encouragement. The meeting was just the beginning. That afternoon, Camille received an email from HR. "Camille, we need to discuss concerns regarding your recent performance. Please come to my office at 3 p.m. The words felt like a punch to the gut. She had poured everything she had into her work, yet here she was, being called in for underperforming. When she arrived at Marie's office, the HR manager greeted her with a professional smile that did little to mask the gravity of the situation. "Camille, thank you for coming in," Marie began, gesturing for her to sit. "We've received some feedback that your productivity has been slipping. I wanted to address this with you directly." Camille felt a lump form in her throat. "I'd like to clarify that I've been taking on a significant amount of additional work lately," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I've been covering projects for other team members, including Elise." Marie raised an eyebrow. "Elise? Why would you be covering her work?" Camille hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "David has been reassigning some of her tasks to me," she said carefully. "It's been difficult to keep up." Marie leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't the first concern we've heard about workload distribution in your department," she said. "Can you tell me more about what's been happening?" Camille took a deep breath, the floodgates opening. She described how Elise frequently avoided her responsibilities, how David's favoritism shielded her from accountability, and how the rest of the team was growing increasingly dissatisfied. "There's been a lot of turnover," Camille added, "and those of us who stay are overwhelmed. It's not sustainable." Marie nodded, taking notes. "I appreciate your honesty, Camille. I'll look into this further." But Camille's relief was short-lived. Word of Camille's meeting with HR must have reached David because the next day, he called her into his office. "Camille," he began, his tone cold, "I understand you've been raising concerns with HR about the department." Camille's stomach tightened. "I was asked to provide feedback, and I was honest about the challenges we're facing," she said carefully. David leaned forward, his expression hard. "If there are issues, you should bring them to me, not go behind my back." "I have brought them to you," Camille replied, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. "But nothing has changed." David's lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to focus on your work, Camille. Leave the department's management to me." It was clear that any further complaints would only make her situation worse. The HR inquiry begins. The turning point came 2 weeks later when Marie informed the team that HR would be conducting an inquiry into the department's operations. "This is a routine check-in," Marie said during a team meeting, her tone neutral. "We want to ensure that everyone feels supported and has the resources they need to succeed." But Camille could see the tension in David's jaw as Marie spoke. Elise looked equally uneasy, her usual confidence faltering. The inquiry was anything but routine. Over the next 2 weeks, employees were called into private meetings with HR to discuss their experiences. Camille's turn came sooner than she expected. The inquiry sent shockwaves through the department. Employees whispered nervously in the break room, speculating about what HR was uncovering. David's behavior grew more erratic. He became harsher in meetings, snapping at employees for minor mistakes and micromanaging projects he normally ignored. Elise, meanwhile, avoided Camille entirely, her usual smugness replaced with unease. One afternoon, Camille overheard a conversation between two coworkers in the hallway. "They've been interviewing people for over a week," one whispered. "I heard they're looking into Elise and David specifically." "About time," the other replied. "It's been obvious for months." Camille didn't join the conversation, but she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps finally the truth was coming to light. The presentation. The boardroom was a pristine space on the top floor of the building, its polished wood table gleaming under soft overhead lights. Executives filed in, their expressions neutral but sharp, each carrying laptops and notepads. David and Elise took their places at the head of the table, Elise practically glowing with anticipation. Camille sat near the back, her presence barely acknowledged by the two people about to take credit for her months of hard work. Richard Cole, the COO, was the last to enter, commanding the room's attention with his no-nonsense demeanor. "Let's get started," he said, nodding toward David. David stood, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for joining us today. Elise and I are excited to share the results of our department's latest initiative, which has already delivered significant improvements." He gestured to Elise, who rose with practiced poise. Elise began the presentation with a confident smile. This initiative focuses on optimizing workflows and increasing efficiency across teams, she said, clicking to the first slide. By streamlining processes and reallocating resources, we've achieved a 20% improvement in overall productivity. Camille gritted her teeth. The words Elise used were pulled directly from the project brief Camille had written, and the data on the slides was the result of weeks of meticulous analysis. As you can see here, Elise continued, gesturing to a chart on the screen, our department has outperformed initial projections, setting a new standard for operational excellence. Richard raised a hand, stopping Elise mid-sentence. This is promising, he said. Can you walk us through which processes were streamlined and how they impacted productivity? Elise hesitated, glancing at David. David interjected smoothly. We utilized a combination of project management software and team restructuring to achieve these results. Richard's expression remained unreadable. That's fairly broad. Can you provide specific examples? Elise's polished demeanor began to falter. Well, one example is how we consolidated reporting structures, she said vaguely. It allowed us to streamline information flow. Another board member leaned forward. How exactly did you measure the 20% improvement? Was it based on task completion rates, time efficiency, or another metric? Elise opened her mouth but seemed at a loss for words. Richard's sharp gaze shifted to Camille. Camille, I believe you worked on this project as well. Could you clarify the metrics used to calculate the productivity improvement? Camille froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to be addressed, but the room's attention was now squarely on her. Yes, she said, standing slowly. We tracked task completion rates and time to resolution for key deliverables. The 20% improvement was calculated by comparing baseline metrics from the previous quarter to post-implementation data. She clicked to the next slide on her laptop, displaying a detailed chart. This slide breaks down the specific metrics we tracked and how they align with the outcomes. The room fell silent as Camille walked through the data, her voice steady despite the tension. Richard nodded approvingly. Thank you, Camille. That's the level of detail I was looking for. He turned back to Elise and David. Why wasn't this included in your presentation? David stiffened. We wanted to focus on the broader strategy rather than the granular details, he said, his tone defensive. Granular details are what support the strategy, Richard replied, his voice cold. Another board member chimed in, directing their question at Camille. It seems like you have a deep understanding of this initiative. Were you involved in its development from the beginning? Camille glanced at Elise, who looked pale, and then at David, whose jaw was tight with barely concealed anger. Yes, Camille said carefully. I led the data analysis and implementation planning. The majority of the metrics presented today were compiled as part of my work. A murmur rippled through the room. Camille's contribution